Among the iconic classics that define the PlayStation 1 era, there's a nearly secret gallery of games that flew under the radar for most players, whether due to bad timing, weak marketing, being overshadowed by bigger titles, or simply for being a little too ahead of their time. This video isn't just about revisiting these forgotten titles, but about breaking down what they tried to do, where they got it right, and why they never quite got the recognition they deserved. These are games that, despite their flaws and limitations, still shine through with personality, creativity, and a spirit of experimentation that's hard to ignore even today. Some feel like historical records of a bold transition era, others remain genuinely fun to play, but all of them have something meaningful to say about one of the most unpredictable and daring periods in gaming. Here are 10 PS1 hidden gems that deserve a second look. Pac-Man World. At a time when 3D mascots were popping up everywhere, Pac-Man World made a quiet entrance, without the hype of Crash Bandicoot or the grand ambition of Mario 64, and because of that, it mostly went unnoticed. In the middle of all the noise from established franchises and big-budget newcomers, it was easy to overlook, but this game had its own strengths, and real ones at that. Instead of just slapping a modern coat of paint on the classic, Pac-Man World introduced a real adventure, mixing solid platforming, thoughtful level design, and clever nods to the arcade roots of the character. Every stage felt carefully built to balance challenge and accessibility, with secret areas and collectible items that actually made you want to replay levels. It's the kind of game that's immediately likable. Pure, straightforward simplicity. Nothing groundbreaking or epic, just focused, well-made fun. The graphics are modest, but charmingly colorful and clean, and they've aged surprisingly well. The soundtrack matches the mood perfectly. Light, catchy, and full of personality, capturing the upbeat spirit of Pac-Man's universe. It's one of those ironic cases where the name, as iconic as it is, might have worked against it. People didn't expect Pac-Man to work outside the maze, and that preconceived notion kept many players away from a game that deserved more attention, especially among platformer fans. Today, Pac-Man World stands as a hidden gem, accessible, full of charm, and perfect for anyone looking for an honest, no-frills challenge. It doesn't try to reinvent the genre, but it delivers exactly what it sets out to with confidence and heart. It's one of those titles that wins you over effortlessly once you give it a chance. Pandemonium 2. Released during a time when platformers were undergoing a radical transformation, Pandemonium 2 brought bold visuals and challenging gameplay that didn't fit neatly into any category. It was too colorful for adults and too difficult for kids. But for those who stuck with it, the game revealed itself as a tight 2.5D platformer, with unique physics, striking creativity, and an addictive sense of rhythm. If Pac-Man World leaned into charm and friendly design, Pandemonium 2 went in the opposite direction. It was surreal, saturated with color, and borderline psychedelic. Each level felt like a dream sequence that didn't care about being weird or excessive, and that's exactly what made it stand out. The game embraced its own strangeness and ran with it. Beyond the visual identity, the platforming was surprisingly tight and satisfying. Movement was responsive, though it required a bit of adjustment, and the physics, odd at first, soon revealed themselves to be consistent and deliberate. The game also made clever use of evolving camera work, allowing for a more immersive, almost sensory level of exploration that expanded the traditional idea of 2.5D. Switching between characters added another layer to the gameplay. While you could complete stages with either one, each character had distinct abilities that affected how you tackled specific challenges. It introduced subtle strategy without ever feeling forced. Despite their trippy look, the levels had structure and variety, and collecting all the coins to unlock bonus stages added another dimension for completionists. The game's aesthetic choices, absurd humor, and even a hint of narrative cynicism gave it an identity few other titles dared to claim. Revisiting Pandemonium 2 today is like unearthing a kind of platformer that no longer exists. Fast-paced, bizarre, visually bold, and challenging without being unfair. It's a game that deliberately strayed from the mainstream, and because of that, ended up overlooked. But for those willing to give it another shot, it still delivers a one-of-a-kind experience. Jade Cocoon? Just like platformers saw huge creative leaps on the PS1, JRPGs experienced an even bigger wave of experimentation, and Jade Cocoon was part of that wave, though it slipped in quietly. Released without much fanfare, And overshadowed by heavyweights like Final Fantasy and Xenogears, it suffered from minimal marketing that didn't do justice to what the game was actually offering. But those who gave it a shot discovered a deeply unique RPG, one where creature collection and fusion were tightly woven into a story filled with symbolism and melancholy. The idea of capturing monsters to fight alongside you wasn't new, but Jade Cocoon added layers that turned a familiar mechanic into something surprisingly original. Yes, you could recruit wild creatures to aid you in battle, but you could also fuse them into entirely new beings, combining their attributes, skills, and elemental properties. And if you weren't too emotionally attached, you could even turn your creatures into silk for profit. Yeah, I know, kinda dark. What made the system click was its unpredictability. The same species could vary wildly in stats and elements, making each fusion feel like a mix of experimentation and strategy. It was simple enough for beginners, but deep enough to satisfy players who wanted to dive into its mechanics. From personal experience, if you got too carried away with fusing, you'd end up with a grotesque meatball of a creature, with unbalanced stats, abilities, and elements, and visually unfortunate. Beyond the monster system, the story offered themes of spirituality, grief, and inner demons. It wasn't front and center, but it framed the world well and added emotional weight to your journey. The gameplay was clearly the star here, slower, more contemplative than most RPGs of the era, but the narrative knew when to step in and when to let the mechanics breathe. Of course, Jade Cocoon wasn't perfect. It was short, occasionally repetitive, and the monster variety was fairly limited. The overworld felt uninspired at times, but there was something in the game's atmosphere that made up for it. The world breathed mythology and mysticism, with art direction shaped by Katsuya Kondo, known for his work with Studio Ghibli. That influence was felt in the handcrafted feel of the environments and creatures. Strange, spiritual, and just different enough to stand out. This was an RPG for those looking for something quieter, less focused on spectacle, and more on subtle immersion. There was a sequel on the PS2, but it didn't quite deliver the evolution fans hoped for. Still, the original remains a forgotten gem in the PS1 library, especially for players who love deep systems hiding beneath modest visuals. Digimon World. Released at the height of the Pokemon craze, Digimon World was seen by many as just another attempt to ride the wave. But anyone who actually played it knows how different, and bold, it really was. It wasn't a copy. It had its own concept, its own philosophy, and it took far more risks. The game wasn't just overshadowed by Pokemon's popularity, it also had gameplay that could be intimidating at first glance. A lot of players weren't ready to take on the responsibility of literally raising a digital creature as if it were a pet. Feeding, training, letting it rest, taking it to the bathroom, managing its mood, discipline, and health, all of that was part of the experience. But honestly, it wasn't as overwhelming as it seemed. In fact, it was incredibly rewarding, and once you got past that initial barrier, you were met with a unique, immersive, and challenging game that rewarded you not with flashy cutscenes, but with genuine progress and emotional investment in your digital partner. And that was only part of what made Digimon World special. The battle system broke all the expected rules. You weren't in direct control of your Digimon's every move. You gave commands, used items, and mostly watched as your Digimon acted based on how you had trained it. It was a kind of agonizing pleasure, watching your partners succeed or struggle based entirely on your previous choices and present commands. What happened outside of battle directly shaped what happened within it. Then there was the evolution system, a masterclass in hidden complexity. It wasn't random, but it often felt that way. Evolutions were determined by a mix of stats, weight, care mistakes, discipline, happiness, battle count, learned moves, and other behind-the-scenes factors in a way that made predicting the outcome nearly impossible. It turned every new Digimon into a discovery. You never quite knew what you were going to get, which made every playthrough feel different and personal. The game also offered a genuinely open, immersive, and interactive world. You weren't locked into a set path. Progression was free-form, and the pace was set by you and your Digimon. It didn't hold your hand, and that's what made the sense of exploration so powerful. That same depth, paired with a serious lack of clear explanations, turned many players away. But that unpredictability, that need to test, fail, learn, and adapt, is exactly what makes Digimon World such a compelling experience even today. It's a game that demands patience and attention, but pays you back with one of the most original RPG experiences on the PS1. A title that somehow manages to be both beginner-friendly, and genuinely challenging for seasoned players. Herc's Adventure. During the late 90s, when cinematic action games and increasingly realistic graphics were taking over, Herc's Adventure looked like a kid's game. With its cartoony visuals, slapstick humor, and lighthearted tone, it didn't exactly match what the market was starting to demand. And to make matters worse, it was completely overshadowed by Disney's big-budget animated Hercules game, released around the same time with all the weight of a major film tie-in behind it. But while one relied on the popularity of the animated movie, the other stood on its own merits. Beneath Herc's Adventure's childish appearance and goofy humor was a surprisingly well-designed game, with solid cooperative mechanics and a mythological world full of personality, detail, and references to Greek legends. You could play it solo or with a friend, and both modes worked great. The freedom to explore, clever puzzles, and simple but thoughtful combat created a gameplay loop that was smooth and engaging. There was a rare balance between accessibility and challenge. The world didn't follow a fixed path or strict structure, which encouraged experimentation and exploration. The non-linear progression made each playthrough feel different and kept things fresh. Herc's Adventure ended up lost in the middle ground, too silly for players looking for serious storytelling or visual realism, and too obscure to compete with the commercial success of Disney's version. But its charm remains untouched. It still delivers genuine fun, especially in co-op, with that kind of over-the-top humor that now feels almost nostalgic. But hidden beneath it is level design that's far more polished than it first appears. Grab a couple of friends and revisit this irreverent little world, and you'll find a game that's still full of surprises. Herc's Adventure is one of those titles that might seem forgettable at first glance, but shows real value once you give it a proper chance. Dino Crisis 2. While the first Dino Crisis tried to replicate the Resident Evil formula with dinosaurs, focusing on a more intricate plot and a suspenseful, isolated atmosphere, its sequel went in the complete opposite direction and in the most unexpected way. Dino Crisis 2 ditched psychological horror and slow pacing in favor of intense gunfights and fast-paced arcade-style action. The shift split opinions and pushed away fans who were expecting another traditional survival horror experience, but what it lost in tension, it more than made up for with energy, flow, and pure fun. The result was a game that was fast, vicious ally striking, and ridiculously addictive. The combo-based point system, paired with the in-game weapon shop, gave the gameplay a strategic layer of progression. Every successful kill streak became currency for upgrades, encouraging players to master the combat and replay sections for maximum efficiency. The weapons were varied and felt genuinely impactful, making your loadout choices a meaningful part of the experience. Combat was constant and frantic, giving the game its own distinct identity within Capcom's lineup and setting it apart from its zombie-themed cousins. Another standout element in Dino Crisis 2 was its use of daylight environments. Instead of the dark, claustrophobic terror of the first game, this one leaned into open, tropical, and wild locations. It felt less like a horror game and more like an interactive Jurassic Park adventure, and that shift completely changed the mood in a good way. And this was a game that didn't try to hide its over-the-top nature. It fully embraced non-stop action and arcade logic, and because of that, it remains one of the most addictive experiences on the PS1. Even though many still prefer the first game for its atmosphere and suspense, the sequel carved out its own space by choosing adrenaline and momentum. It's proof that sometimes taking a completely different route can lead to something unforgettable. Vagrant Story. Even though it came from the same team behind Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story never achieved the same commercial success. Part of that is due to its complexity. Dense menus, a combat system focused on targeting body parts, deep weapon customization, and a steep learning curve made it feel impenetrable for many. But that's exactly where its greatness lies. Vagrant Story is one of those rare cases where mechanical ambition walks hand in hand with narrative boldness. The gothic atmosphere, the dark political storyline, the sharp dialogue, and the flawless artistic direction all came together to create a mature, layered, and immersive experience that felt years ahead of its time. It was a game that didn't compromise. Entering Le Monde meant paying attention to every system, every line, and every nuance. Combat required strategy and constant experimentation. It wasn't just about swapping gear, but about understanding enemy resistances, crafting weapons tailored to specific types, and mastering a gameplay rhythm that felt almost handcrafted. The customization was so in-depth that your choices directly shaped the difficulty of your journey. Even today, very few games manage to combine such refined storytelling with such intricate mechanics. Vagrant Story demands commitment, but rewards it with a rare kind of depth, both in gameplay and in narrative. It's the kind of experience that becomes unforgettable once it finally clicks. A true classic, not made for everyone, but still unmatched in what it set out to do. Soul Blade. Overshadowed by the later success of Soul Calibur and buried under the flood of 3D fighting games on the PS1, Soul Blade went unnoticed by many, but it was actually the true pioneer, bringing weapon-based combat into the 3D space with both style and substance. Released during an era dominated by names like Tekken and Virtua Fighter, it was often treated as a curious Namco spin-off, rather than the beginning of a franchise with its own distinct identity. Fighting games at the time weren't just moving into 3 dimensions. They were constantly experimenting with new mechanics. Real-time transformations in Bloody Roar, multi-plane special attacks in Toshinden, interactive stages, and experimental energy systems were all part of the mix. Soul Blade made a clear bet: focus on weapons, unique fighting styles, and the strategic possibility of ring-outs. That gave battles an extra layer of tactical depth. Its true strength, though, was in its pacing. Fights were more deliberate, emphasizing weapon reach and spacing. Each character demanded a different tactical approach. It wasn't a game where you could mash buttons and get lucky. You had to learn the timing, the distance, and when to break through your opponent's guard. The Edgemaster mode was another standout. It didn't just provide story context, it delivered uniquely crafted challenges and objectives. Matches became asymmetrical, forcing you to adapt constantly. Opponents might have an advantage, you might be under a restriction, or the environment might throw something unexpected your way. And at the end of each stage, you earned a new weapon. It was basically a campaign mode, something extremely rare in fighting games of that era. You could argue that other fighting games on the PS1 were more refined, but Soul Blade was one of a kind. It didn't just pave the way for a legendary franchise, it also introduced mechanics that would only be fully appreciated years later. Revisiting Soul Blade today is a reminder that innovation often happens in the background, drowned out by louder titles. But the foundation was already there. Vigilante 8. In the shadow of Twisted Metal's massive success, Vigilante 8 was seen by many as a lesser alternative in the vehicular combat genre. But far from being just a copy, this game had a personality of its own and plenty of qualities that made it stand out. Set in the 1970s, with a soundtrack, art style, and cast of characters pulled straight from that decade, it was clear from the start that this was going in a very different direction. Each character was a deliberate caricature, with unique vehicles and backstories that, even within a simple story mode, gave each selection some real identity. The physics were smoother and more responsive than in most competitors, allowing for more satisfying control and faster, more dynamic combat. The weapons also deserve credit for being creative, varied, and full of secondary effects that encourage strategic use rather than pure chaos. The maps were another highlight. Interactive and often unpredictable, they offered multiple tactical options. Blowing up structures, triggering traps, or using the terrain to your advantage gave each battle a different flavor and helped set the game apart from others in the genre. Visually, Vigilante 8 leaned into a more colorful and exaggerated aesthetic, steering away from Twisted Metal's dark and apocalyptic tone. The result was a game that mixed fast-paced action with a loud, absurd sense of humor, making for a lighter but equally entertaining experience. Even today, it remains more accessible and just plain fun than many of its peers. It may have been underestimated at the time, but it stands as a great example of how the PS1 was home to bold, alternative takes on established genres. A true cult classic that deserves to be rediscovered. Croc, Legend of the Gobos. Even though it was one of the earliest 3D platformers on the PS1, Croc, Legend of the Gobos was quickly overshadowed by more charismatic and technically polished competitors like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro. Its biggest issue was timing. It came out too early, at a point when the very concept of 3D camera control was still experimental, and developers were still figuring out how to work in a new dimension. The controls were stiff, built around a tank-like movement scheme, and the camera often did more harm than good. This made jump precision a constant issue, which is a big problem in a game centered on platforming. But despite these technical limitations, there was a lot to appreciate here. Croc had charm. The worlds were varied, with colorful environments and creative enemy designs. The Gobos, little creatures to be rescued in each level, added a collectible element that encouraged exploration and gave the journey a stronger sense of purpose. Visually, the game had a friendly, inviting style, with characters that felt like they were pulled from a Saturday morning cartoon, and it worked for what the game was trying to do. It's one of those games that, even with its flaws in plain sight, showed ambition. It wasn't just trying to translate 2D platforming into 3D. It aimed to build its own universe, with structured levels, boss fights, and hidden secrets that rewarded player commitment. Today, Croc plays almost like an archaeological artifact from the transitional era between classic 2D and modern 3D platformers. An honest snapshot of the stumbles and bold attempts that paved the way for the hits that came after. These games may have never topped sales charts or received flashy remasters, but each one left a mark on those who played them. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these hidden gems did you already know? Are there any other forgotten PS1 games you think should have made the list? Drop a comment below, share your memories, and let's keep this conversation going. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a great time to do that, and stay tuned for more content like this. After all, part of the magic of looking back at gaming history is realizing just how many great stories are still waiting to be rediscovered.